Let's start with the before lecture chant, everyone. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning, everyone, and really appreciate you joining in today for the first day of our third non-monastic practice period here at Bodhiok Zen Center. And the ritual that we do at the beginning of every Sunday program is actually a ritual to open the Zendo. So today we opened our practice period also, so we have begun. And practice period is called an ango in Japanese. And by having a practice period and offering a practice period, we're actually honoring, as so many other Buddhist sanghas around the world are, a very long tradition that actually dates back to Shakyamuni Buddha. And at that time, you might know that many monks led a very itinerant life, often walking from one monastery or one teacher even to another, across the countryside throughout the year. And during the monsoon season, the rainy season, the rice fields fill up with this rainwater, which is very important to their growth, of course. And there usually are not pathways around, so the monks would just walk right through the rice fields. And that caused a lot of damage and a loss of crop and money for local farmers. So they decided they would take their problem directly to the Buddha, as the story goes. And as a result, he enacted new regulations for all Buddhist sanghas, which is there is no travel during rainy season. And even today, if a monk would like to travel to another monastery, they must have arrived at the destination before the rainy season begins, and then spend the entire rainy season at that one place, normally 3 months. Thus, this 3-month period became a time to set aside each year when members of the Sangha could meditate and study and work together. And today, we honor and continue this ancient practice by taking time out from our busy lives to the extent that we can to deepen our commitment to Zen practice and to continue to meet together to share the integration of our practice with our lives. And a traditional practice period today is often, not always, 90 days long, but it can vary in terms of length depending upon the Sangha itself. Ours being this year 4 weeks. In the past, I think we've done 6 weeks, I think. And according to the tradition, as you know, and what we did in our first 2 practice periods, is it begins with a Shuso, our head student, entering the ceremony. You remember Linda was Shuso in 2021, and I was the year before. But we do not have a Shuso this year, and thus no entering and closing ceremony. But we still honor this tradition through our commitment to deepen our practice together for these 4 weeks. I have to admit that it took me a while to decide on what we could study together. Not for a lack of things to study together, but I finally settled on the book that we're using, titled Women of the Way, Discovering 2,500 Years of Buddhist Wisdom. And this is by Sally Tisdale. And since the beginning days of Buddhism, women have practiced, and the teachings show how they wholeheartedly have co-created our history and transmission. And this text honors some of these women, our ancestors, through brief records of their enlightenment, sometimes in the form of a poem or a teacher's comment, or a sermon, a teaching that has been handed down through the ages. But there is very little to nothing of their long journey to enlightenment. And the author calls her work actually a narrative history, in which she uses, and I quote her here, known facts in historical context to tell the stories of these female ancestors. She also admits, rather unashamedly, that because women ancestors and their stories were commonly ignored or left out or erased completely, she had to, in some cases, use her imagination about their lives, based on what she did know. And in these stories and the talks that we will give about some of them during the next 4 weeks, you will briefly meet a few of these remarkable women who are still speaking loudly to us today. I feel very fortunate that I and Linda had a root teacher, Myoan Grace Shearson, who was committed to integrating and honoring our female ancestral lineage into Zen practice. There was a loud and strong call for change in Zen, and Grace was actually in the forefront. In fact, by the time Linda and I began studying with her in 2008, she had already been acting chair of the Soto Zen committee charged with creating a female lineage paper. And in 2010, the Soto Zen Buddhist Association of America approved a document honoring our female ancestors, and as we know, a richer history of Zen continues to emerge. And I just want to show you this document. Kate, if you can give us the first picture. So this is the document that this committee created. You can imagine, and you can't really see it. I'll send it out to you. I'll send it out to you in an email. You won't be able to necessarily see all the names, but we will get a close-up here in just a second. But just want you to think about what a task this was, actually, of taking over 2,500 years of history and whittling it down to the names that are actually inscribed on this document. Okay, Kate, the next one. Okay, in this one you can see that sort of in the top third, bottom of the top third, this wheel begins with Mahaprajapati, the Buddha's aunt, stepmother, and the person who raised him, followed by Mita, sometimes called Sanghamita, and Yasodhara, the Buddha's wife and father of his children, and so on. Also, if you look towards the bottom, you'll see Mugai Nyodai, somebody that Linda's going to be talking to you about, coming up in a few weeks. So thank you, Kate. I think it's important that we know this exists. We know it exists, we know it's being used around, hold on, let me get us back to full screen here, there we go. Used by Sanghas across the US. You know, they chanted homage to our female ancestors, as we do in the echo after the Heart Sutra. As you know, it begins the great kind founder, the original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. And immediately following that, we chant the first female ancestor, Mahaprajapati Gautami, and the succession of female ancestors. So there is our homage, if you will, to all of our past women teachers, known and unknown, there following the Buddha, and before Bodhidharma, Dogen, and Manjushri. And many Zen centers and monasteries chant a dedication to women, Dharma ancestors, during their regular services and at special events throughout the year. And you might recall hearing a similar dedication of merit as the one included in the back of the book. You can hear this in some of the services at Upaya, at San Francisco Zen Center, and all the sister centers. It usually starts with Prajna Paramita Dayosho, Mahamaya Dayosho, etc. So these women are being honored in ways that maybe we're not thinking of, but consistently and more as the years go by. In fact, in the chaplaincy program at Upaya, at the end of the first year, those who have not yet received the precepts, in other words, received the Jukai ceremony, they prepare to do so with Roshi Joan, Halifax. And even if we've already received the precepts from our own teacher, which was my case, I still prepared most of the documents by hand, and one of them was the female ancestors lineage chart. A powerful and really beautiful way to honor those who are named and also those who are unnamed. So practicing in Zen today, we can see much commitment to incorporating the lives, the names, the stories of women into ritual and practice. Women who make up not only our past, but for many of us, our present and our future, as the author points out. For her, and I feel this way too, and perhaps many of you, these women are alive for us. They are models, and I quote her here, they are models and guides and parents, as well as teachers. They are imperfect, they're flawed, and struggling people who were not that different from me. Their awakening and transformation makes mine possible, end quote. I realize that many of you do not have the book, maybe, so I just want to give some information about what you're going to find in here and from which we will be giving our talks through the weeks. The book begins with, there are really 4 sections in here, and it begins with mythical ancestors. And the first of those is, of course, Mahamaya, the Buddha's biological mother. And you probably remember the story of the birth of Buddha, and you can understand why, obviously, Mahamaya is included here. And she was very human, but in the telling of the birth of the Blessed One, she also was very kind of superhuman. If you remember, he is actually born out of the side of her body. This actually was probably more a sanitizing of the actual event, but she did have superhuman qualities that allowed her to leave this particular life and then return in another form, for instance. And some of the women included in this section you might remember from our study of the Lotus Sutra. That was in the first practice period. There are women proving, to men mostly, that the law of the universal nature of Buddhahood appears in all beings, in all forms. In other words, yes, women can and do become enlightened, and can and do become Buddhas. The second section focuses on a dozen Indian ancestors. And these stories of what are often called the first nuns in Buddhism, well, they're not called that, they are that. The first nuns in Buddhism all come from the time of the historical Buddha, when he was alive. And there aren't many sources describing their lives, actually. But we do have a collection of their own writings. It's found in a text called the Therigatha, or translated as the Poems of the Elder Nuns. And available, by the way, you can get a copy of that. And as you might expect, Mahaprajapati, the Buddha's aunt, and really mother throughout his life, begins this section. And she was, of course, the first ordained woman, the first to lead a Sangha of nuns, said to have been 500 or more in number. Or we can read about Dhammadinna, whose husband left to study with the Buddha, as men could easily do, uproot, leave their families for the good of awakening. And bravely, she too followed her heart. She left home, she became a wanderer in a very dangerous time for women to be out alone. And with time, she became enlightened. Much later, Dhammadinna meets her ex-husband, who's really in awe of her wisdom. And Ashley says she is so much more awakened than he is. Good for him. And he shares her words with Buddha, who remarks that, oh, she is very wise. And he tells the husband that he too would have given the exact answers that she had given. So his advice to her ex-husband, listen to her. The women's community during the Buddha's time was, according to the author, vital and expansive. And even after his death, both nuns and monks established more permanent communities, both in and outside of cities and towns. However, as she also writes, women gradually simply faded from the records of Indian Buddhism. Part 3 of the text is focused on Chinese ancestors, beginning with Bodhidharma's female heir, Zongqi. Now this is in like 500 to 575. And although there are records of earlier Chinese Buddhist nuns, you may recognize some of them. The brilliant Ling Zhao, the daughter of Pang. There are many workshops and practice periods and Dharma talks about Ling Zhao and her father Pang. And Ling Zhao, you remember, is someone who regularly one-upped her father in lively discussions of Dharma. Or you might know Liu Tianmo, Iron Grindstone, we called her. Iron Grindstone Liu, whose teaching style has been described as precipitously awesome and dangerous. I love that. And who also exhibited an iron-like strength in Dharma combat. Or Moshan Laoran, 9th century, called Mountain Summit. She was very famous in her time. She was a woman role model, prominently cited for her wisdom by Dogen himself. And she was the first woman to hold an equal place in the Chan, Chinese records, and the first woman recorded as an official Dharma heir. We don't hear much about them, some of them. In general, the Chinese records, women have supporting roles, of course. They might appear in the stories of male teachers with whom they study. Ling Zhao, for instance, or they might be known for their own stories in koans as Liu Tianmo, or as famous female teachers such as Moshan Liaoran. And as significant, of course, is this third section that's focused on Japanese ancestors. And much like in China, sources for learning of the lives of Buddhist women in Japan is really scarce and fertile at the same time, according to the author. Zenshin, the first ordained Japanese woman, is really not even known today, as are the disciples of the masters we know well. We know little about the disciples of Dogen, Keizan, and Hakuin. Others are well known today, such as Kakuzan Shido, mid-1200s to early 1300s, was the founder and first abbess of the very famous Rinzai Temple, Tokeji, still in existence in Japan, and also known as Tokeji's third abbess, Shotaku, a warrior woman with a powerful paper sword. This line of women included in the text dates to the 19th century in Japan. And Tisdale suggests a very, very difficult time for Japanese women who were on the path. Yes, there was some independence and accomplishment for sure, but there was also great difficult times of suppression and frustration for them on the path. Tisdale ends her book in the afterword with some stories of what she calls the new ancestors, such as the first Westerners to do traditional Zen training in Japan. Ruth Fuller Sasaki, you might know, and there are a number of others. So there we go. And before we embark on this journey together, I'd like to read to you the dedication at the beginning of the book. And I quote her. Dedicated to all the old women, the refreshment sellers, little girls, rice cake vendors, laywomen, wandering nuns, courtesans, and goddesses who endlessly preach the Dharma in countless stories and are never named, end quote. Tisdale chose what is really only a handful of women, of course, to highlight in her book, but let us think of them as representing our long shared lineage of thousands of women who gave their lives to the Dharma for our benefit and the benefit of others. Our female ancestors most often experienced great hardship, prejudice, and oppression, but in miraculous ways, and sometimes not miraculous ways, some of their voices were heard and are thankfully still heard today. Our journey then, during this practice period, is to not just honor them, but to bring awareness to their wisdom and their courage, their struggles and their failings, and to bring alive in us their unwavering commitment to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha.